This is a conversation with Nigel Baldacchino, a renowned Maltese photographer. We talked about several of his projects, through which we came to some understanding of his process and photographic approach. We explored the tension between the sense of depth and the sense of flatness that coexist at times in his photographs. We talked about oranges and arrows as metaphors for his photographic quest. So, if you are ready to question how you see the world, to let your inner landscape be your guiding device, please come along. This is the place for you.
Hello.
Hello, Nigel. Welcome,
Hi.
and thank you very much for accepting this invitation to the
Thank you
interview.
for having me.
I will dive right in. So I would like to talk about some elements of your photographic language, and maybe we can discuss some axiomatic aspects of the photography themselves. And I would like to have your view on those. So, for example, I noticed that in your work there is a recurring exploration of, let's say, transparency and texture, and you seem to use those elements to mediate the viewer's access to the scene. For instance, in the fog, atmospheric elements or the lack of focus produce a curtain-like effect between the viewer and the scenario. Or in the project of the scan misprints from the printer, the HP Color LaserJet, you introduce textured layers that further distance the viewer from the image. And one final example, the poles, you capture these peculiar pieces of rudimentary engineering that you use as decorating objects in the landscape. And at times you almost seem to try to hide behind those. So, can you please expand on this aspect of your photographic approach? Uh, what does this interplay of layers and texture mean to you as a photographer, and what do you hope it conveys to the viewer?
So yes, definitely there is this underlying device that I use. In that sense, I'm always drawn to this idea of some conception of a veil between one's eyes and the rest of reality, mostly as kind of it comes in as a stand-in for many things. So there is the element of, for instance, in the series Fog, what I'm doing here is basically shooting most of the time behind a physical screen, which could be either a net or some kind of barrier between me and the rest of reality. But in what it serves here, what I was looking at was basically what it does to our visual vocabulary. Kind of, if you see a visual language, if we perceive something as a visual language, which anything we see, we have to conceptualize in a visual language of sorts. And putting something between you and everything else is a way of reconsidering that language and reconsidering the lexicon that you process the world with. So in this case, for instance, I was really curious about the sense of blurredness of what you're looking at, and the different textures of blurredness and what they mean to our perception, in the sense that something can be in focus but behind something else, a net, and it's still blurred, like what you're seeing here, that is in focus, but it is blurred because of whatever is in front of me. But something could also be out of focus, and that means a certain thing. It's a cue for our head to perceive depth, for instance. And all these different languages of blurring is something for me to reduce the almost reduce the words that make up an image, reduce it in more manageable parts. What I did with the series mostly was it's after doing these images and after going through the whole thing, I was it's recalled for me my state of the anxious mind in that sense, because being overwhelmed with anxiety, overwhelmed with a mental state of that kind does to me is mostly to flatten the world around me, and suddenly nothing is in perspective anymore. Everything is in the same level in front of me. I can't distinguish much. That is what being overwhelmed means. So fog, the idea of fog is kind of an ironic one, because none of these images actually have the physical fog that we talk about. It is a fog that comes from somewhere else. It is a fog that is more about our way of seeing rather than actual obstacles, etc. It is kind of, yeah, our sense of internal landscape in a way.
I am a bit surprised to learn that you have put screen-like objects in front of your lens in order to reduce the readability of your final images, let's say. But putting that aside for a moment, these days I was researching on you, and I came across this interview in which you describe this crippling effect that anxiety has on your visual perception. And I shared this piece of information with a friend. She's an optometrist, and surprisingly for me, she told me that this is a real phenomenon, that people that are experiencing a certain level of anxiety, they have their depth of field significantly reduced for a moment, and that the world is really flattened for that period of time.
Are you joking?
No, I'm not joking actually.
Oh, seriously?
And I was wondering, well, is Nigel being literal?
Wow. That's incredible actually, because yes, it does feel quite literal, but in my head it was still in a metaphoric sense, because, well, metaphorically in a sense, well, to start from there, I think that the brain is not very adept to distinguish metaphor from literal meaning, that there is a whole neurology to that. But it's very interesting because when you are anxious, one of the things that goes out of the window first is that problems, whatever concerns, and their urgency lose meaning completely. Everything from trivial things to very deep things become as urgent as everything else. So yes, you do lose. You can't put things in perspective anymore metaphorically, but it's
And
also
apparently in the literal sense also.
so wow. So these photos actually make sense. I'm almost disappointed.
Oh, don't be.
Wow, thank you for that. Okay. Um, for the misprints, it is interesting. In this case, these were photos that I had taken, regular photos, if you want, and I had basically tried to print a lot of them at one go on a regular laser printer to print thumbnails for me to use to sequence for a photo book. I went to check eventually, and I saw this effect happening. What's happening is that the printer overheats and is repeating elements of the previous images onto the next one, kind of an imprint. And what that translates to is, yes, again, like you were saying, a sense of veiling, a sense of pollution, something in the perception of what you're seeing is polluted with something else. And in the sense, maybe the unintentionality of it and maybe the visual appeal of it, it made the images into something else completely, and it lended them a sense of abstraction that for me was, I had never seen anything like it. Um, somehow it doesn't relate to the fog images for me, but it's still, yes, I am very much, I find that idea quite appealing. For the Poles series, which is one of my earlier ones where I was still using 35 millimeter, in general, I think I am quite somehow concerned with the layering of scenes in front of you. So I tend to give a lot of emphasis on what is behind one another, and this I tend to play a lot with the sense of depth versus and making it somehow um, live at the same time as a sense of flatness. So, for instance, with a case like this, the composition is such for me that I know that these poles, these elements, are far from each other. And at the very same time, I know, and at the very same time, I'm feeling this flatness of it. So it's this combination that somehow always I was drawn to on some level.
You have explained a bit of the way you feel it, display with photographic language, and you shared also the psychological aspect of your practice. What do you hope to convey, and what has been the feedback to this approach of yours?
For me, the kind of feedback, well, what I hope it translates into is I I do see these kind of images that I showed you a lot. It is quite it's a common device that is used even in contemporary photography. This kind of blurredness, this kind of I can see but I can't see, etc. It is kind of very much used. What I like, um, what I want, what I would imagine people looking at these images seeing is the specific nature of the device that I'm using. So by device, I mean narrative device. So it is the like in the fog sense, it is not just a a device to blur the definition of an object from another. It's not a visual effect that is applied. It is actually imbued in our, yeah, I think, yes, thinking about it, what I would want to, and what I got in terms of feedback as well, is that it doesn't feel like I shot something and then I applied some effect, or I shot something blurry, say a long exposure or anything.
Well, it looks full integrated in your language. Both the language and object is fully integrated. I feel the same.
It is the specificity which I am after, the kind of questioning of why is, how does this feel deep and flat at the same time? How it's that kind of questioning that I am really after, and in general in my work, I would say.
Well, coming across your ideas and your philosophy that can at times be very deep, and I also that is revealed in your interviews and your conversations that I could listen. Um, well, you have a complex exploration of context and meaning, I would say. However, for example, in works like Clear Windows, the images themselves are fairly direct and simple. So how do you approach this challenge of translating such a layered thoughts into photographic projects?
So for Clear Windows, that's quite interesting, because for me it is pretty much a very similar principle that's working here. It is merely a use of, instead of using, or instead of a veil that is kind of a bit grainy, etc. This is about the clarity of windows. So the when you look at windows, when you look at glass, it is of course always assumed that glass is see-through, that glass is very, again, it's a reconceptualization, or whatever. It's a contemplation about clarity, the sense of clarity. So in this sense, it is glass. So glass warps. For a while in physics, it was conceptualized as a very dense liquid. By a very dense liquid, I mean that if you look at surviving medieval windows, you will realize that above in the glass pane is much thinner than below. Why? Because the glass literally moves down it by gravity, because it was seen as a fluid. In that sense, this project was a contemplation again about the idea of clarity, or of perceived clarity. But it was, of course, around this different visual language, which is more architectural, more concerned with actual space, mostly interiors, but not only. It felt like a fresh thing to be doing, and a fresh approach, but at the same time, I think I approached it in the very same way that I approached just everything else, as in the mindset and the concerns, whatever goes in my head while taking a photo, were always the same. It's a different edit of sorts, but it does stand out as a series. compared to everything else I did. When I started this series, I was in the US, and it was my first time seeing. Well, of course, I am a big fan of modernist painting, of modernism, of 20th century painters and their sense of edges. And I was being bombarded with these images and paintings of that kind of composing. And in my head, I kind of absorbed it probably, and I was trying to apply it to an architectural space, a photographic space. And between that and the physicality of glass, this just built up, really.
I find it interesting that you refer to glass as a fluid, as a very dense liquid, which can be demonstrated by observing medieval windows and the effect of gravity through the centuries. This allows me perhaps to extend the analogy to photography itself, which is often seen as a still image, obviously as a very small fragment of the that we extract from the space-time continuum, but that can also be seen, at least in the psychological realm, as a like a frame of the ongoing movie of our visual perception, of our photographic vision, and of our vision in general. Also, making a bridge to our previous conversation, I would like to point out that a window is also a framing device. It's a flattening device of the world that can turn our three-dimensional perception of the world into a two-dimensional object. And
Yes.
You talked in a very rich way of this work in some of the interviews that I could access. For example, you referred to windows as valves of equity, hinting perhaps on the way architecture can reflect socioeconomic divides, let's say. Do you think that the images themselves should convey these ideas, or it is necessary to have some text to carry the weight of those heavy concepts?
Yes, in that specific text, I had written about those things simply because also informed by my architectural experience, etc. And they all came from the state of mind I was in while taking the images. Does it need to transpire to a viewer looking at the photos themselves? Not particularly. It is in Italian. They have this beautiful expression. It's chiave di lettura, which literally means key to reading. So it is this idea of giving someone a key to a different, literally a different reading of something. How I go about the idea of putting text in a body of photographic work or anything is pretty much in the same way. In movies, you have an overdub. Sometimes you have someone telling something, in the film. Does it need to explain something that's happening? Not really. It's just another narrative tool that the filmmaker has. It is an artistic accompaniment. My texts are, as much as I try not to have them. I don't like didactic texts.
I was referring specifically to some concepts that you have been presenting in your conversations. Um, Maybe you can explain to us what do you mean by valves of equity?
So, valves of equity in the sense that windows are something which, so between outside and inside, you have either, in our architecture anyway, wall, which is you can't see through it, but we have also windows which still block weather and everything, but you can see through it. Like the visual spectrum passes through to a certain degree. But what it does reflect is if the interior is brightly lit and outside is darker, looking from inside out, you will only see a mirror, basically. So you'll see yourself. And it's the other way around as well. If outside is bright, inside it's dark, people will not be able to see through. So valve of equity in that sense, that if I it is the glass is only transparent.
They are valves of light for sure. So
No, equity in that sense, if both inside and outside are at exactly the same illumination, so equity, then you have clear windows. Then you have windows, the glass being whatever transparent, or the highest degree of transparency. But once, which is most often the case, there is a difference in brightness and in luminance in either between inside and outside, then the glass will reflect most of the light back. And the more it reflects, the less, the more difference there is. So valves of equity in that kind of tongue-in-cheek sense of it gives a window gives you the sense of how different inside and outside are in terms of ambience.
I understand that you have expanded that analogy to social issues, maybe of socio-economic nature.
Yes, so basically, in architecture, when you buy windows, when you buy glass, um, the clearer glass, which is with no iron inside, with no green, that kind of green thing that you find in most common glass. Non-reflective glass is extremely expensive. Last time I checked, anyway. While the more reflective kind of glass is the cheaper glass. And walking in a street, walking in an urban environment, by looking through the windows themselves of buildings, you can tell which ones, to a certain extent, but you can tell which ones are the cheaper kind of windows because they are very reflective, etc., and they reflect in certain ways. And the more expensive, the more high-end things, because they are extremely clear. I don't know if you have any experience. Sometimes I had experience walking around in cities around Europe, and as soon as I enter a very rich area or neighborhood, suddenly the windows become extremely transparent, to the point where, like, is there a window or not? Just because it's low ion, it's low reflectance, it's very expensive, basically. So yes, there are these considerations that happen. And then an island like Malta, where, well, I know quite a lot the market of how glass is here. um, you can you can tell quite easily. But the project in itself is about the physical presence of glass, in the sense that we as architects, we as human beings use it. And the underlying assumption is that you put glass there because it's transparent. But in reality, glass has its own physicality. It has its own visual presence, and that is very important in our lives. It's not like a, an urban environment where glass doesn't reflect, so all you see is as if it wasn't there, would look extremely different from the urban environment that we are used to in cities mostly.
So it appears to me that your concern in terms of photographic development of this project, it's very much with this relation between the inside and outside through the study of light in a way, and from the study of the device, the window itself. And that, well, you are not so much concerned to translate everything that is in the back of your mind conceptually, like the social equity that, well, otherwise you would be perhaps a more documentary project that would put on comparative images that would highlight those disparities or something like that. So your approach is much more introspective in a way and more subtle, and makes sense.
Yeah, like I was saying, it's important for me because it's something we think about a lot. The elements of text in photographic bodies of work. Do you need it? Do you not need it? How do you use it? I have a I have a quite a particular position in this, in that, yes, if it is there and it is another creative device and narrative device I have to shape or to affect the body of work I have, and that's it. You can ignore it and you can read it. It's not there to make sense out of anything. I use it creatively.
So let's talk a bit about Pinetu.
Yeah.
So I will tell you my understanding of the work, and then I'll let you correct that if needed. So in Pinetu, you photograph a grid of pine trees planted by the British rulers, arguably to discourage social gatherings and to enforce control. And what happens is that this particular place has been, this particular park has become paradoxically a gathering place for marginalized communities such as heroin users and the so-called male cruisers, subverting in a sense this original intent. Um, I was seeing your project and I was thinking of about a project of my own, if you allow me to share it. So for 6 years, I was photographing in the Lisbon's gardens, and well, I've photographed in about 72 public gardens, and what has motivated me was because this very object of what is a urban garden looks very odd to me, and I don't understand it very well. And also when trying to photograph it, I had to deal with the planes. So the garden is in principle designed in the horizontal plane, but everything that you see, the way you live it, is through your vision in a vertical plane. And I realized that, for example, transparency and the way you feel more isolated or more integrated in the urban landscape, it's the language of the garden itself. So, and also I have understood that the garden has become kind of stage for the fringes of society in a way. So you can meet several kinds of marginality in one safe place. So continue with your work. I think you have criticized this rehabilitation that has been taking place in this particular park as a form of sanitation that hides uncomfortable social realities. Yet in the Pinetu use 500 millimeters lens to focus solely on trees and what seems to obscure again the reality as well. So I would like you to comment on this and well, the same approach as before. You choose a distant the distance of the subject as part of your photographic language. And is this approach itself part of the critique, or does it create a tension between your ideas and your images, let's say? I would let you expand in any direction that you enjoy to talk about this body of work.
You might regret that. um, uh,
Well, these are my impressions of the work, and I shared a
yeah,
bit of my work, and to plant the seed, let's say, for you to talk in and to take it
that,
in any direction.
that's very interesting for me, that you shared your work, that, if I can understand correctly, circles around the idea of a um, a public park. In this, in what I'm doing here, it's very much about, well, it is about my relationship with this very, very, very specific park in Malta. Um, for me, the use of the 500 millimeter lens is critical to this body of work, in the sense that it informs a it informs a way of looking that in itself expresses, for well, the way I see it, it expresses a lot in itself about the park and what it stands for and what it conveys. The park has been nicknamed as, well, Tanemisa, which means the onlookers or the peeping toms. In a sense, it is a lot about covert gazing. So I am looking at you, I am looking at this, but I don't want to be seen looking. It's about the onlooking, and it's about the, yeah, covert looking, illicit sense of illicit looking. um the 500 millimeter lens conveys that, in the sense that the way it's, like this one for instance, the way it um renders the reality in front of you,
The
in
compression
the way,
aspect.
yes, the way it compresses everything even in that very basic way of how perspective is seen, that kind of perspective is exclusive, uh, is exclusive to this idea of peeping, of looking at something very specific in a distance. So this lens is used for people watching birds. This lens is used for private investigators looking at something from a distance. It is this idea, and I was fascinated by the fact that the the visual language itself, as you can see here, kind of transpires something about the feeling of a place. So it gives something away. Now, people who are not accustomed to seeing photos which are very distant, very different lenses, what might not kind of be sensitive to it. But in my head, you will still feel that there is something different in the way you are looking, in the way this thing is seen. And that is like I talked about this before, but it is a project, even if it's called Pinetu, even if it is about the park, etc. But it's much more about the way of looking rather than what is being looked at. That is what encapsulates this project for me. This is a very biographical. It's quite a standout in the rest of what I do, because I don't usually work with, if you want, content. My work is more about form in a way. My work is more about, yeah. So specific content like this are a rarity for me. But as it turns out, it ended up being a project about form anyway, because it, like I said, like all of my work, it is more the focus is on how am I looking rather than what am I looking at. It is, of course, it is an introspective project ultimately, and not and not a journalistic approach to documenting, not a documentative project of the park. And this realization is something I came to later, much later in the project, because I literally set out to I wanted to I wanted to take photos of the park for a long time, and I wanted to kind of explore it, and I wanted the photos, the project to be about the park. That's what I've told myself so many times. But the more I edited, the more I retook photos, the more people I showed and stuff, it started to become very clear that it's really not about the park, but it's about the emotional landscape that the park lends itself to in my brain, what it represents for me in a
So
way.
maybe I would ask you to expand just a bit more, if you would. In this aspect, you say that this is about the way of looking more than the subject itself, and that is a way of introspection. So, what can you share? Well, since introspection, I assume that is kind of private, the way you feel in relation to the place and to photography, maybe, and to the way you see the world. But what else can you give us a glimpse of this introspection? How do you use this exercise?
Well, so it's a question about the use of introspection, or is it a question about my relationship to the park and how it reflects here?
Introspection mainly.
Yeah. So yes, this is a very big and important topic for me. I have there is an exhibition project that I am part of, which is called "Those Eyes, These Eyes, They Fade," and it is exactly about that. It is exactly about the idea that, well, it kind of is a nod to the use of photography as gazing out, looking out, as a tool of looking in, which is a paradox, of course, but it is the way some people use the medium in itself, and it's the way that I gravitate towards the medium in what you look at, and the way a photograph, like I said, is the subject is always secondary. The actual subject, you mean the sense of evidence in a photograph, look at the sense of look at this kind of, is not there, or the emphasis is definitely not there. The emphasis is on the fact that the way I'm looking at something and the way I'm showing you these images that all have this thing in common, you get you come away from that feeling that there was a latent feeling inside the images themselves, which was very specific, but it's not about what you saw, as in it's not about subject, it's actually about the way I'm looking, like I've been saying. So if you see my other series, for instance, and you ask a question, you find someone after an exhibition of that kind of work and you ask them what were the photos of, it's irrelevant. It's completely irrelevant. It is literally me trying to articulate something, a state of mind, something inside, whatever, some obsession, articulate it instead of words, instead of something else, by the use of my way of looking, by the use of a photograph. And that is, yes, it's pretty much the underlying theme in everything I do, especially in photography.
So let me tell you what I have understood so far, and you will have the chance to correct it if necessary, or maybe we can exchange some comments afterwards. I think I will try to connect these two ideas that we have so far laid out. The one of the flattening of the world that you associated with your experience of anxiety, and this later idea of the sense of place that it's common expression among photographers. But there is one feeling that I am familiar with through photography, and that I relate with these ideas of yours. That is, how can I describe it? The sense of having arrived too late to a party, or maybe too soon. And this latent lack of meaning, this latent feeling that we associate with the sense of a particular place, is eventually broken by a sudden enter of someone in the place, or some music colors there and inflates the world, and we can see things in perspective again. Well, I would argue that this silence between events is ultimately what we are trying to capture in our wanderings. So I have once read a book, maybe you know it, Italo Calvino.
Oh, okay.
Have you read Palomar?
No, I haven't read that one. No.
It's a story about Palomar that is sitting in his garden, just contemplating and listening, and he is listening to the birds uh, talking to each other, and he reflects on this, trying to understand if the important part of the message is in the singing or is in the between of the each one, the time that it takes to the other to respond. So in a sense,
The interval.
yes, the interval, like you in your project blink, you talked about, and you considered that our blinking is the interval between with which we punctuate our vision, let's say. So this latent feeling, and it's in the between of the making sense of the place. So how do you? I'll let you respond to this observation.
Um. So yes, of course, I second pretty much all you said. For the way I look at it, is more in the lens of, well, I tend more towards phenomenological kind of thinking, and it's very interesting for me to, well, at some point I read and heard a lot from an anthropologist, Tim Ingold, who does a
So as far as my philosophy and understands, phenomenology is about the subject more and the subjectivity,
the
no?
what, phenomenology is where Ponti and stuff like that. It's about um well, that's whatever I say will sound very
Well,
stupid as a definition of
no, just I want to say, how do you apply that to your vision? So what elements
it
of
is.
this current that you apply to your vision?
When I said that what I do mostly is about seeing and not about what is being seen, that is very phenomenological. It is kind of, it is the something's presence, my presence, and how do I read? Well, I think at the very base of it, it is how we relate to our immediate reality. Um, in the anthropologist Tim Ingold, he didn't invent this, but he points it out very nicely, the distinction between explicit and tacit knowledge. So tacit knowledge is the things we know on some level in our body, in our brain, in our emotional self, etc. But they are, it is knowledge that bypasses our cognitive self. So our bypass is kind of, it is knowledge that we don't necessarily know we know. It is knowledge that I can't access with my cognitive brain at any point in time. Whereas explicit knowledge is the knowledge that I know that I can explain to you. Like you ask me something and I explain, yes, this is this, this is this, this is this, because cognitively I have access to that knowledge very easily. That's explicit knowledge. That's the knowledge in photography to translate to the evidence. So I take a photo of something that is the subject is the evidence. It's the explicit knowledge. Tacit knowledge is something that sits slightly more in the background. So if you want, it is not extremely different, as in the way I read it, between the conscious, i.e., cognitive brain, and the unconscious, the subconscious, or whatever you want to call it, which is working in the background. And although I don't necessarily agree with the distinction between knowledge, between conscious and subconscious,
Well,
as we
the way I
usually
would
do.
maybe put it would be pre-conscious, maybe, or
Well, all right,
simply
fair enough.
non-verbal
Well,
knowledge.
non-verbal is pre-verbal is not is yes, speaking to the tacit knowledge that I'm talking about. So this kind of work and this kind of dynamic, I'm not saying that it's me doing this or me inventing this or coming, not at all. It is something that photographers have been doing for a very long time. Um, it is expressing, it is, well, attempting to inhabit more and express more something from our tacit selves rather than from our cognitive selves. And in some sense, this is literally everyone does this. Every artist, every photographer, even a photograph. I give you a photograph of a lamp. I take a photo of a lamp and I show it to you. In the way that I show you this lamp, in the way that I position it, in the way that I focus it, in the way that there are hints of my tacit background and my tacit kind of preferences visually. And so there are, for instance, you take fashion photography, take someone like Irving Penn, for instance, I'm a huge fan. And he did fashion photography. So he did literally what would translate to explicit photographs of people. But there is a lot of tacit going on in there. Why and how? Because, well, you can easily distinguish an Irving Penn from another photographer. Why? Because there are traits there that are less conscious and that are happening that speak more about his internal landscape and the way that he saw things, and less about what he's seeing. And, well, some photographers do it under a cap of taking photos of things, and like documentary photographers, like even though you're just showing things, you're always biased and you're always predisposed, and that's tacit. And from the other perspective, someone like me, someone like a lot of people other than me, we actually own that level of subjectivity and that level of introspection and that level of exposition of an internal landscape. We own that and we actually work from that. And that is
So
for me,
it seems
yeah.
that you are positioning yourself more in that side of
Yes,
perception, and you try to react and be more sensitive to those inner hints to build your narrative
I would
in.
say even more. I would say that those things are the actual triggers that push me towards the medium of photography. That that is photography for me. That is what brings me to the medium. And yeah, so it is more a question of how much I acknowledge that and how much it is a driving force to me. It has always been, ever since, well, since I was a teenager or something. I picked up a camera. I was always thinking about, um, the way I'm looking and not what I'm saying. There was always a sense of exposing something that, oh, sorry, not exposing, expressing, it's a better word. Expressing something that I don't have cognitive access to, rather than that. So it was always a dynamic, and it's not good or bad or noble or anything. It's just that is where my source, my what pushes me towards photography as a medium. That's what it is for me, and it is for a lot of things. For a lot of other photographers, even contemporary.
I would like you now for you to explain a bit about the project The Sea. From what I could access in your website, it looks like you were exploring a sense of maybe decadence and decay along the shoreline, I suppose. And you have been capturing some spaces that seem gradually damaged over time. Can you please explain this body of work to us? And maybe you can see some images as well.
Sure. This was a body of work that I started off. So I did the long-term program with Penumbra Foundation, and this basically a whole year of you bring along a project. I brought along a series of photos, and you elaborate it over a year. So I started with a lot of photographs I had already that for me evoked a specific image. It's like when you're playing a chord, when you're in a band, someone hits a chord and you're like, ah, that one. And you don't know why. It just rings true to you, it resonates. And there is this kind of sense and a lot of images that I had already had this sense that in them, and I collected them. So I wanted to explore that. Eventually, it developed to a degree that I could explore, I could identify that feeling, that sense, that this chord, this whatever it is, this resonance. I could identify it more clearly in my head. And I so much so that I ended up taking photos from there. And most of the photos you see here are basically photos I took after, which is very interesting to me. For me, this series.
After the residence, you mean?
No. It's after, well, during the residence. I mean, my initial pool of images that I had, that I went in with, I almost, none of it is here. None of it is left. For me, this series speaks a lot to a sense of ambivalence, a sense of ambivalence in the psychological sense, as in psychoanalytic sense, Melanie Klein, etc. Ambivalence is the phenomenon where you acknowledge that something, a situation in front of you, has a lot of opposing things, qualities going on. So, yes, at the same time. So you don't necessarily, you can't say anything specific about it. It is these images.
You can see both sides at the same time without
Yes,
privilege.
but it is sometimes you hear people saying it feels cold but warm at the same time, or it feels near and far at the same time. Sorry, near but far. In these images, for me, as I articulated in my head, it was images that felt cold and warm, distant and close. They had a lot of this sense of yes, the sense of ambivalence. It's like I can't say much about these images because they are so many things at the same time. And the more I looked at it, and the more I started, yeah, articulating it cognitively in that sense. So eventually, I ended up at the last moment. I ended up changing the title completely. Before, I landed on the sea.
Can you explain
This,
a bit of this process of the giving this title?
yes, because the sea. Well, I am Maltese from Malta. We're surrounded with the sea, and the sea has always, for me, been an emblem of ambivalence, in the sense that, yeah, the sea is a lot of things at the same time, and it doesn't care in a way because, well, let me explain it a bit better. You know that there is this tendency of us making a creature or a human,
Oh, I like to say
yeah,
it.
humanizing things to make a metaphor out of them. So you hear a lot about the sea is cruel, or the sea is something or other. For me, the sea is an emblem of how non-existent that is, because the sea is all of the things at the same time. And so, which is why I ended up doing, well, with this piece of writing, which I included. I think it's here. Yes.
That's a
So
poetic text, right?
yes, it's a, well, it's a poem that describes for me this sense of ambivalence and this sense of yeah, of different qualities being there at the same time. And this, well, in this poem I talk about a lot about distances, inner distances. So the distance, for instance, between me feeling love towards someone and at the same time feeling a kind of repugnance towards that person. But the a lot of these conflicting things that are conflicting only because I am imposing that conflict, because in reality they are those the conflicting things are part of the same thing. It's only me making a conflict out of them. So yes, these inner distances that just pile up in our brain about our concept, that are drawn from our conception of different things, which in reality don't exist. By in reality, I mean outside of our own heads. Not that our head is not included in reality, but that's a different subject. But so there it is, kind of, yeah, the sea is not a creature. It rides on its own back, at once contain and express calm and storm, absorb and absolve, save the floating and kill the drowning, wrestle at shore and rest at depth, reflect light and contain it, hide what it is by telling the truth. It's, yeah, it's, well, it's, yes, the series is in a way, it is a form of, this feeling around the series is a form of resistance against simple narratives around things. Wow, I said that for the first time. It made sense. Yeah. This temptation I have of making a simple narrative around something to explain it to myself or to feel a
That
specific
leads
way about it.
that leads me to ask you about something that we have been alluding to almost the whole interview. That is this concept of inner landscapes, let's say. So your work often evokes these subjective realities, and that are spaces, internal spaces, and are less tangible, let's say. How do you approach um, photography as a medium for capturing these abstract concepts? I'll ask this as kind of advice because that's perhaps an issue that many of us have to deal with. So,
I mean, I, hmm, like I said, that's the reason why what's in it for me in photography and in art and etc. So it's the place I start from, which I can't explain to myself. But I just literally take photos. I go out there, I take photos, whatever feels like, whatever feels right. So state of flow, etc. When you're in some kind of state of flow, you're not thinking
so, so,
cognitively.
y- sorry for interrupting, but at any point, do you feel the need or the effort, let's say, to translate these complex philosophical ideas and concerns of yours into, well, into a photograph, into a series, into a project?
No, actually, it works completely the other way around for me. It is literally, photography for me represents a state of flow. Like I was saying, it enables me to just go out there and without too much thinking, just take photos that feel relevant to me at that given point in time. And then I end up with a lot of photos. And then in the editing process, as I am looking at different photos I took, I start um, I start thinking and I start drawing elements from it, from the body of work. And then that is a seed that grows in my head, like I was saying with the sea. So I had all these images, but what is this feeling that is common to all of them? So I start in my head, it becomes more and more and more defined, and to a point where then I question myself, okay, it is clear enough in my head now that I can think about it more cognitively and what it elicits for me. And then from there, the whole thought grows, the whole whatever, conceptualizing, confabulating, whichever term you want to use. It's there. That's why photography is so important for me. Because yes, a state of flow is is critical. The whole, well, by now it's a cliche, but the whole idea that there is a text, there's a book that's 1970s tennis instructor wrote, and which became a big textbook for psychology. It's the basic premise is you cannot think about playing tennis and play tennis at the same time. So it is, which is essentially what became the conceptualizing of the idea of flow in pop psychology and whatever. But that is the critical thing for me. And I practiced photography for so long now that it's a very important channel that I have towards that state. And then, yes, from there, it grows and grows and grows. Like, yes, I was thinking about this the other day, which makes a lot of sense to me, which is why series are important, and which is why kind of this conceptualizing keeps making sense to me. Is so if I show you an image with a bunch of fruit in it, and I ask you, what is this image about? And you'll tell me there's a bunch of fruit. And I will tell you, you're right. But if I show you two images, both with a bunch of fruit, but there is things in common. Like in both of them, there is an orange, and there are other things. And I ask you what about, and you say, well, there's a lot of fruits, but there is an orange in between. And if I show you 400 images, and they are about everything, there's all kinds of shit there, but there is always an orange in there, then you will tell me that series is about an orange, because it's the only common thing you see. And in a very simplistic and stupid way, that is my springboard in doing photos, like you see in my series and different things.
Well,
I don't
that
know.
example makes you think if it is about the orange or if it is about what is changing,
No, no, no.
like the clear windows project.
Yes, yes, yes. Completely.
It
I
is
mean,
about the changing of light. It's perhaps.
it's a thought. It's a thought exercise. It's not a visual thing about the. But these common things, these common elements, like for instance, the orange. Since I was talking about tacit knowledge before, I take a bunch of photos, and some of them have this thing, like I was saying about the sea, that there is the orange somewhere. I have no idea what the orange is. So what I do is I try to get a feeling for what is in common. I internalize it and I take more photos. And suddenly, this sense of an orange comes along for me. And that is when I start the actual cognitive thinking around it. Like for me, the sea is perhaps the first time where it was very clear that things were working that way. So once I can see the orange, which I can't explain to anyone, I can put a lot of images that ideally in someone's head, in the viewer's head, they do see this thing. And they will not tell you it's the orange, but they will tell you that it feels deliberate. The intention of the series it doesn't feel like this guy is taking random photos of different things. It feels deliberate. There is something in common there, a momentum or whatever that feels specific. So much so that my cover for the sea is an image of an arrow. Let's share screen for the last time. There you go. This is in the way. This is that image is the back of an arrow that is driven into a wall. So you see its shadows from the different lights. And that was very critical for me, because these images are about a very, very, very specific thing, that specific point. I don't like ambiguity.
Well, the arrow is the very symbol of aiming to...
Exactly. That narrow aim is what my photography is, in my head, at least, in my whatever, is what my photography is about. So if someone would tell me that the photographs feel random or feel ambiguous, that means that something went awry, or whatever. People are free to interpret however they want.
Sure.
But for me, the best, it is about that narrow focus. Even though you look at the images and there is nothing very narrow about them, they are about a lot of different things, whatever. But that is it. So,
well, from what I'm understanding, when you start the project, although you don't have perhaps a previous conceptual frame to work, you have already from the beginning a sense of direction, and that you aim through the sessions, and you will continue to explore that feeling and that hidden vision, let's say.
That sense of direction, though, because people get stuck, and photographers get stuck, and artists get stuck, and I get stuck with this idea of having a direction in my head, going out there to manifest it. The direction comes, I do have triggers of sorts, but the directions come from editing and from taking whatever photos that feel relevant to me, looking at them in context of other photos I did and stuff like that, and editing them in a way that something arises from it. And then the thoughts come. And then, so there is a lot to learn from poets and from people in the literature, but poets especially. So there is, learning poetry. A poetry teacher will, there's a lot of books about this. You don't go out there and think of something and write a poem about it. So you don't have some knowledge in your head and you go out there and write a poem about it. The form itself speaks. So you have maybe a triggering notion in your head of whatever I'm starting to write about this day I had, or about my cat. But as you write, that trigger, that first thing, dissolves very easily. And the process of writing itself, that sense of exploration embedded in the medium, that is what will guide you to the quote unquote real subject. and that is exactly what I try to do, and that is my process. That
I
I say
think
this because it's a
I think that speaks very closely to, well, to the vision of the photography as a metaphor for our own perception, because in the sense that every piece of perception that we take from the world is framed by definition. Our our very senses are always framed, and you have to rely on the relation between the elements within the frame to try to make sense. And in that sense, I think photography is very analog to the way we perceive things, the way we feel it in a non-verbal way sometimes, and well, even in verbal times we have to attribute context and meaning to stuff, and that's one aspect. One final axiomatic aspect of photography that I would like to ask you about. So, as I was saying, photography is by definition a small extraction from the world, a small fragment. But what we know is that the frame of makes us to try to recover the feeling and the sense of completeness. So we instinctively try to relate the elements within the frame. But paradoxically, it seems that you try to intentionally highlight the fragmentation aspect of your vision, so that sometimes the photographs don't well, they make more sense if when we see the whole series. So how do you navigate this tension between the fragment and the context in your work? That would be my question.
yeah. I think the my natural inclination towards the medium is there is a lot of in my work there is a lot of compression everywhere, in every series, and somehow I feel, I don't know why, I feel inclined um towards this compression. Either it's a zoom lens or something, uh, a very narrow instance of reality, but very narrow, very small, very compressed. That is what feels real to me. That is what feels real in terms of a photo that I am drawn towards. So in that way, I am I am not cognizant when I'm taking photos that these are that these will read as fragments or of a whole or something. Like I said, I'm just taking photos of things that appeal to me, whatever they are. I I have to remind myself, and this is very important. I have to remind myself that I take photos because I have a lot of fun taking photos. That is my thing. Um, Eventually, again, when I am editing stuff, it does start to be very apparent in my head that there is a very fragmentary nature to what I took and what I want to reveal. I think it's I think it speaks a lot to the introspective element when we are looking for a language of, well, uh, of introspection. we I am not looking, well, I am not very inclined to find a complete picture of anything. I can only aspire to observe this little fragment that feels true, this little fragment that feels real. This I can only aspire to that kind of thing if I want something that feels very real to me. This is a very personal thing, but so in that sense, I think it speaks a lot to my dynamic of introspection, of how I look inwardly to into my own landscape, into my own mental landscape, etc. How my approach to things and my natural yeah, like how materials have their natural resonance. That's whatever they do, they will always have that natural resonance. I think that would be my natural resonance. This kind of dynamic of seeking these fragments. Probably, I don't know. It's something I've given a lot of thought to. I don't think I've actually arrived to some kind of epiphany about it. I think it's I think it's ambition and imagination. I'm not that ambitious. I am very happy with finding very, very, very small things that feel real. And I don't have the imagination of completing them in one thing. I I'm happy with describing very, very small things that I probably can put together in some way to make a bigger thing. I don't believe in complete visions at all. I don't believe in when we're talking about this kind of photography and this kind of arts and this introspective stuff. I don't feel in any degree of I don't believe in any degree of completion. I believe that whatever pieces you can bring to the table that feel honest, that is the biggest ambition that I could allow myself in a way. That's a very contrived way of answering your question, but that's all I have.
No, that's an awesome way to end our conversation. I have one more question for you, a final one, but I
Go
would
for it.
like to thank you so much. This has been wonderful and you are very generous in the way you talk about your photography and your process and your personal way of experiencing photography. Um, if is there anything else that you would like to point people to know or some idea that you would like to sum it up?
Um, I think we've covered. Uh, no, yeah, I think it's.
And in this case, I would like to 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 ask you two things at once, if you would. That well, you have been commissioned to for the first edition Malta Biennale as a exhibition designer. I will give you the chance to talk a little about that, and I would like you, if you don't mind, to incorporate in your answer what would be the your view about the place of photography in public spaces and outdoor installations. This is well, this is an interest of mine personally, and a question that I have been repeating to the people that I have been talking to. So thank you so much, and
Something that acts as a buffer between an artwork and an existing space. And that is conceptually, that is very important to me and has been a very interesting learning experience. Why? Because for my own things, for my own artworks, like I did with the Pinetu show. It became natural to think, to elaborate a lot in my head the idea of the physical presence of an artwork in a space. Whatever artwork you present in a gallery space or in an exhibition, it's not a for me, presenting a photo framed on a wall is just as it's just another decision, just as designed as what I did in Pinetu, which is basically to make to present them in 3D in paper. It is always a statement and a design decision, whatever you do in a space, in a gallery space. So my experience in exhibition design has led me to think a lot about that and think a lot about gestures in exhibition. So what spatial gestures do I want? What kind of extending how would the spirit or the energy of this series, of this body of work that I have, extend into a space? So suddenly it becomes an expressive tool, just another expressive tool in my toolbox. Just another expressive tool to express a photographic body of work in a space. So I think it's important to make a distinction between exhibition design, which is, okay, I have this thing, I put it here, and I design around it, whatever, and the exhibition design I do for my own stuff, which is, I have this thing. Okay, now how do I extend the spirit of it into the space? So I can print it like this, I can present it like this. It's not about, people will criticize and tell you it's about presentation. It's not about presentation. The actual work is that. So for me, it taught me a lot about how I perceive my own work. And that's very important to me. About photos in public spaces, it's very tricky for me. Very tricky. I can't. Very tricky because photographs tend to be very, like we said, well, composed in a frame, and they don't tend to like a lot being presented in a very busy environment visually. In outdoor spaces, usually it is a very busy space because there's a lot of elements that you can see, and you will always see these works in a context which is very dense and very busy in itself. So it's very tricky for me. That said, there are great examples of this happening. Recently, I've been to an exhibition of Terry Weifenbach, whom I admire a lot. She had a show along a pathway in Cannes, as part of the Biennale of Mulhouse, Photography Biennale. In Than, she had an exhibition along a pathway along a river. So it was more controlled, it was more kind of, there weren't a lot of things happening. And there, yes, there, photographs in a public and outdoor space made a lot of sense and actually did contribute to the spirit of the work, greatly so. Yeah, in general, I think my position would be, does this space and this presentation, inside or outside, but outside is more difficult, does it contribute to the spirit of the work, or is it working against it or overemphasizing it, or what is the relationship between the space presentation and the nature of the work? That is always the question. And outdoors, yes, it becomes harder because it's usually is a very specific place and you have weather, you have everything.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Nigel. See you next
Thank you.
time.
I hope you will edit this quite a lot because I blabbered.
Thank you for watching to this conversation with Nigel Baldacchino. I strongly encourage you to check out his website that is beautifully designed and truly inspiring. And speaking of things that are inspiring, if you feel so inclined, please also check out my book Visita Guiada. I will leave the links in the description.